thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the RStudio Enterprise Community Meetup. This is our finance meetup today. I'm Rachel. I'm calling in from our Boston office. I'm actually in the RStudio office today. I'm joined by my co-host, Dylan Lackey from our finance team as well. Dylan, feel free to say hello if you want.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Dylan Lackey here, based out of the US in Austin, Texas. I've been in open source software for many years, helping folks specialize in making that jump from open source to more of a robust enterprise offering. Actually, Rachel is my predecessor, so everything I know I've learned from Rachel. So happy to be here and happy to help out.
Thanks, Dylan. If you've just joined now, too, feel free to introduce yourselves through the chat window and maybe say hello or where you're calling in from. Do just want to mention that if you want to turn on live transcription for the meetup, you can do so as well, just in the Zoom bar below if you press the More button. But to go through a brief agenda for today, we'll just have some short introductions, and then Alan will lead us through their journey towards a reproducible development workflow using a Shiny dashboard framework. And then we'll have lots of time for questions and open discussion too. And just a reminder to everyone that the meetup is recorded, so it will be shared to the RStudio YouTube after. I'll be sure to put that on LinkedIn and Twitter and everywhere that I posted about the meetup too. But just wanted to let people know that if you want to ask questions anonymously and not be part of the recording, you can do so too. I'll put that in the chat window in just a moment here. But for anyone who is joining for the first time, and Alan, if you want to go to the next slide, thank you. This is a friendly and open meetup environment for teams to be able to share the work that you're doing within your organizations, teach lessons learned, and network with each other, but really just to allow us all to learn from each other. So thank you all so much for making this a welcoming community too. We really want to create spaces where everybody can participate and we can hear from everyone. I just really like to reiterate that we love to hear from everyone, no matter your level of experience or the industry that you work in as well. I'll share a few links in the chat if you have any suggestions or want to speak at a future meetup too. But with that, thank you all again so much for joining us today. I would love to turn it over to our speaker, Alan Carlson. So Alan is tech lead for the business intelligence team at Snap Finance. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me stop. Well, it says, let me reshare my screen. Thanks everyone for joining today. So I'm going to talk about building robust modular dashboards with Golem and Graveler packages. We will be going through some just contextual slides to make sure we're all on the same page, but a bulk of the presentation will actually be building a Graveler dashboard with the package. So as far as what we're going to cover today, just a quick introduction about myself. So like Rachel mentioned, I work for Snap Finance. They're a personal lending firm for customers across the nation. And I'm the tech lead on the business intelligence team. I've been a developer for 4.5 years and then a tech lead for the past 2. And when I started on the team, there was only me and another developer. So we've come a long way from just 2 of us to now, I believe, 8 of us on the team. My academic background is in business. So I have my undergrad and master's in finance. And I'm telling you that because just as a disclaimer, since all of my programming knowledge is job-based, I don't have a deep understanding of the finer points of programming. So if any of those kind of questions come up, I'll do my best to answer them, but I understand that's not my exact area of expertise. So with that out of the way, what are we going to talk about? So I just want to give context into the business challenges that we were facing a couple of years ago, why we started on this journey, how we tried to answer with Golem, what is Golem package? How does it, help, reproduce your dashboards? And then Graveler is our answer to what Golem couldn't do for us at the time. And at that point, I'll go into actual coding in R with the actual package installation and building everything. And then once that's done, we'll switch back to the slides for potential enhancements I've thought about for the future. And then finally Q&A. So with that, we'll jump into the business challenge context. So like I mentioned, 2 years ago, there was just two developers, right? It was me and another guy. And we had just started working with Shiny at that point. Up until then, markdowns were sufficient, data pulls were sufficient, but the business was growing and they wanted more interactivity and granular looks into their data. And part of this was we had legacy code that was being transferred to our department. So the data science team had built around these 6 dashboards that were pretty complex, right? They have 6 to 8 different tabs on a sidebar. They all do kind of different UI layouts and backends. And what we noticed was that these 6 dashboards were all coded slightly differently, right? So the look and feel was pretty similar, but some of them had pure API backends. Some of them used SQL instead. They had similarly named functions that did entirely different purposes on the different dashboards. Some used, selectize input versus picker input. And so the challenge was, you spend all this time focusing on a dashboard, but when you go to the next dashboard, you can only port like 40% of that knowledge with the new intricacies in the new dashboard you're working on, right? And so the other challenge at the same time we were facing is we were about to hire 4 new developers that had various backgrounds and skill sets, but they all had minimal experience with R and Shiny specifically, right? And so the questions that we were trying to answer immediately was, well, how do we standardize our workflow so we can minimize future tech debt with our dashboards that we build? And secondarily, how can I get new hires to understand what we're doing and start building dashboards very quickly? Right. And so that when I was researching that problem, we learned about what the Golem package was. And currently the Golem package has a very fleshed out GitHub repo. It has a published book that you can either purchase or view online. But when I looked at it 2 years ago, it was just this little book down with 5 or so sections that had bare bones concepts in them because they're still fleshing out the process. But the idea of Golem has stayed the same, right? They're trying to build modular dashboards with a package-based framework. And before we go into what that means, I just want to cover those concepts really quick with a couple slides. So all Shiny apps have the same thing in common, right? They use a UI to create a layout and then a server to connect data to that layout. And so when you build Shiny dashboards, there's basically 3 ways you do so. Right. The first method is the all-in-one approach, right? So you can make a very simple dashboard with an app.r file, all your codes in one place, and it makes simple dashboards. When you add more complexity, you kind of split the UI and server into their own files because that separates their purposes cleanly, right? The UI has all of the layouts in it. The server file has all like the code backend in it. And so that each of those is referring to its very specific parts. And then eventually it lives in like a single folder, right? The third method is called modularization. And what this does is, let's say you want to build a dashboard that serves like 4 different parts of the business, right? Sales, product, marketing, and like some executive view. If you try and put all of that into one server file, that's going to be a very large server file, which isn't very helpful. So modularization sticks all these sections into their own UI and server for each individual dashboard piece. Additionally, this avoids namespace conflicts that you can sometimes run into with the other methods. But the key point here is that when you modularize your dashboards, the UI and server become self-contained functions that your dashboard will eventually call when it builds its dashboard. So keep that phrase in mind as we go to the next slide. R packages. If you've never built an R package, you've certainly installed one. And what a package actually is it's a bundle of files, data sets, unit tests, and individual functions, right? Whether you're using dplyr or ggplot2, if you look into their GitHub repos, all of their functions are tiny little discrete R scripts that are bundled together as a package, right? And so there's that phrase again, self-contained functions. And so what Golem does, what it's trying to do basically is it looks at the commonalities between modularization and package frameworks. In other words, Golem says, well, if all my modules are just functions already and a package is just a bundle of functions, why can't I just make my dashboard a package and run it and deploy it that way? And the advantage to that is packages are very standardized, right? There are specific folders and directories and locations where files go within an R package. Because of that, though, Golem has no shortage of creation options, right? So if you just install Golem and try and run with their workflow, right, there's tons of different deployment types you can do, either R pubs, RStudio Connect, Docker. I believe they even do like GitHub pages at some point. There's different unit tests you can create either at like the module or the app level. Again, various ways to import files and different configurations for your actual app. And so when I was testing this out, I'm trying to answer those two questions, right? Does it solve those two challenges we're facing? Standardization, absolutely, right? Packages, like I mentioned, they have to be built a certain way in order to work, right? They have to have an inst folder, a man folder, namespaces, descriptions. All of that is standard across like every single R package that's ever built. But because of all these complex options, it doesn't do a good job of communication to new developers or people that don't have a lot of experience with R and R Shiny. And that's by design. If you look at the first page of the Golem book, it actually says, if you're reading this, you have some like intermediate advanced level of how Shiny works on the back end. And this is trying to explore more possibilities there. So what do I need to do though? So we built Graveler to kind of address that complexity. We take away all those options, we strip them down to the bare minimum and say, here's these defaults, let's run with those defaults and you'll be good to go, right? If you're curious about the name, so I'm a huge Pokemon nerd, and Golem itself is, well, I don't believe the Golem package was named after the Pokemon Golem, but if I'm taking this, big complex package and I'm making it simpler, the simpler version of Golem in the Pokemon world is called Graveler. So that's the name there. And I'm pleased to announce that Graveler is available on GitHub currently. So you can search either GitHub on, or not search GitHub on GitHub, search Graveler on GitHub. You can install it with devtools : install _ GitHub /Carl_Allen/Graveler. It's in a bunch of links in the blog post and whatever. So you can install it for yourself there. And so with that, we will switch to my R screen. Part where the PowerPoint exits. There we go. Okay. So I've already installed the package, of course. When you install it, you might run into some library dependencies. This is my first real public package I've tried to do. So if you run into any of that, feel free to raise an issue on GitHub, or let me know at some point, and I can try and work on getting those imports correctly. But when you install it, you should see 0.75.1 build standardized modular Shiny dashboard frameworks. Cool. So that's step one, right? How do I actually start building a modular dashboard, right? It sounds pretty complex. The answer is that it's not hard to do with Graveler itself. So the first step, you'll make a new project either with the button up here, or of course, file new project. You can create a new directory. Then you might be thinking, well, do I go new project, new package, Shiny application? None of them, because Graveler will now have its own little wizard type down here at the bottom. There is also the Golem one, right? Because if you're using Graveler, you have to use Golem as a backend. So you can also look into Golem for yourself at any time if you want. But Graveler is what we'll be focusing on for today. So you'll have just a few simple options here. Directory name, I'll just make this RStudio meetup. I'll just make it as a part of my desktop for now. The package name, usually you want those to be pretty short and sweet. I don't think they run into issues with special characters, but I know there's no issues with no special characters. So that's something to keep in mind. Then over here, you have your display title. So in the top left of your dashboard, that's what the user will see as the dashboard title. Right, so I'll just call this meetup. And then finally, you can put in, we have usernames here. You can put in your full name or whatever. It just assigns an author, so you know who's running that package, right? So you'll create a project. Takes a few seconds to spin up, but then here's the default Graveler layout, right? You have this directory that we just made. has all the necessary files that you need to build a package, and it has the 3 helper files to get you started going, right? So before we get into the first file here, the O1 dev, if you're unfamiliar with packages, this description file is where your dependencies lay, right? So whenever you build a package, you have to import other packages that it might rely on, right? So let's say, you're trying to build some custom package that, uses the dplyr summarize function, right? You have to import the dplyr package in order for your package to work, right? And with a dashboard, you can have a lot of packages. So instead of adding them, one by one, like this, oops, helps if I can type correctly. Instead of imports, I can type dplyr, ggplot2, but it's hard to remember all of those, right? Especially if you have, half a dozen libraries to install. So instead, what this O1 file does, or O1 dev, it will add dependencies to your description and to your package itself. So this is just a vector of the dashboards, the bare bones dashboards that needs to work. Dashboard themes, obviously colors everything, dev tools just in case, dplyr, lubridate, golem, pins, shiny, so on and so forth. I won't go into what all those do. So you'll run the vector, go over to my environment here, then it just runs a simple for loop and attaches those packages, right? You'll notice your console gets very colorful, right? Because it will add the package to the imports field in description, right? So if I swing back around to the description file, ta-da, it has all of my imports ready to go. The second part is we need to add an app.r file for publishing. So RStudio Connect, when it publishes a dashboard, it looks for an app.r file in order to actually tell it that that file is a dashboard, right? If I were to just upload this directory as it exists, RStudio would throw an error and be like, I don't know what this is. This might be a package. I don't publish packages. That's not what I'm here for. Instead, create like an actual file I can understand, right? So you run this line, and you'll notice in my comment that says, be sure to enter 1 in the console prompt. That's because Golem, in order to talk to like the rest of the dashboard backend with its configurations, it has to make its own little YAML configuration file. And so all you need to do is just hit yes, or type 1, excuse me. And then you can read through all this, and it basically says, here's your app.r file. Here's this Golem config YAML file that we have. You never need to edit those. It's just an automated file creation for backend deployment. Then I won't run this line of code because it takes a few minutes, but here at Snap, we've integrated with RStudio's get back content feature. And so what this does, it allows you to write what's called a manifest.json file, which basically takes a snapshot of all your packages so that RStudio can actually connect to your GitHub repo, find that package snapshot, and then publish from that snapshot. It's been super useful because instead of worrying about people individually clicking like the publish button, trying to overwrite stuff, we can all work from the same GitHub repo, same GitHub file, and the dashboards will update accordingly. Right. So then after that's done, you can navigate to the run.dev folder because your dashboard's already ready. So this is the second file that opened. It just navigates to that file. I'll close the description one for now. So this is the file that you actually use to run your dashboard locally. Right. As far as like what all these lines do, the prod equals false basically prevents like console messages from printing, or excuse me, no, true prevents console messages from printing. So when it's false, it allows you to kind of like debug and develop more. Usually I just leave it to false by default. I never really change it to true. The next 2 lines are important because it will detach all your libraries and remove your environment, right? And that's important because it needs to clean your environment so that when you run your dashboard locally, you know that's going to work exactly with what's in the dashboard itself, right? When I first started working with Shiny, I'd run into an issue where it works locally, but not when I publish, because for whatever reason, I had some local variable that was just never in the dashboard. Like none of that logic was present. So it works locally because it's trying to read my local environment. So we wipe the environment to make sure that the dashboard has exactly what it needs to run. Then finally, again, if you're familiar with package development, this is the same thing as the package build, install, and restart function down here. So this creates a namespace, which is where all of your like exports and imports come from. And then it loads like the meetup package. And in actuality, once you run this line, your package now exists in your local environment, right? So I can do meetup : and currently there's only like 2 functions that are exported from it. We can add more. And finally, once that's done, you run the app. And that's it. Your dashboard's already built. It has, the display title that we made. It has a working sidebar example. It has a collapsible sidebar over here, a fun little Graveler logo that you can change. The colors you can change as well. But this took long as I was explaining it, but in reality, you can run all those lines in less than a minute, right? And you have the entirety of the framework that all you need to do is just add modules to, right? Which is a good segue into, how do I create modules and actually put content into this dashboard? So if we go back to the O1 dev file, there was one line that we forgot at the bottom, which was adding modules. So with Graveler, there's called a level up function. And all you do is you can paste that in your console. You don't really want to comment out this line because this is supposed to be just once or run once, right? So I just copy the comment and then put it in my console. And then we'll call this, I don't know, summary or foo, or whatever you want to call your name of your module. I recommend them keeping them small because it is going to add some prefixes to this name. So the shorter it is, the better, while still being intuitive. So when you run the level up function, it's also going to create 2 files to open for you. The mod_name, or summary in this case, and then the mod_summary_fct display.r. I'll talk about this one in a second, but this module is the module code, right? This is one section of your dashboard that you can make. So you might be thinking, oh, great. Let me put in a box real quick. So, width equals 12. Probably need an equal sign there. And I'll do title equals box array. You think, okay, cool. Now I can just rerun my dashboard, right? Everything will work. That is optimistic thinking because it will not work. Because your module has yet to actually connect to your actual dashboard layout, right? And so, there's no new sidebar, there's no box over here because you've built the module, but you haven't connected it to anything, right? So at the bottom of every module, there are these 3 lines that you copy into their respective files, right? So you have your body.r, your app server.r, and your sidebar.r. So I'll open all of those right now. All R files are located in the R folder itself. Here we have app server, body, and eventually sidebar. So you simply just copy all these in order. It tells you where to add them. So I comment out here, adding my module here. For app server, oops. Here. Also a comment, connect to a pin board if you use that part of RStudio Connect. And then finally, you have your sidebar item. There we go. So technically you don't need the example there because the example obviously can't connect to anything. It's just to show that a sidebar is working. So I usually just delete this line or you can comment it out, either or. So this, we'll call a summary. And then the tab name automatically connects to the module itself. And then you can use any kind of the icon libraries, either Fontos, glyph icon, or whatever. I'll show this one chart line. You also don't need to save your files. I just did as a force of habit, which is good, I suppose. But if you have unsaved files, whenever you run the dev file, it will automatically save everything in your package before it tries to build again. So pay attention to app server and body up here. When I run these lines of code, it saves them and we'll incorporate those changes there. So there we go. Summary, text box, hooray. And now you can simply add, as much UI and server functionality as you want, right? That's outside the purpose of this meeting, because this is a back end, not a shiny front end enhancer. Where was, hold on, trying to figure out the order in which I go through this. Okay, so now that we have your module, you're probably asking, well, okay, if we have the module working, what is this file? What is this FCT display file? So in Golem, their philosophy is, you want to abstract away as much as you can from even your module code, right? So for example, you could have a bunch of different charts or tables in this, but at the moment your code starts to repeat itself, you want to put that inside of a function to make this as clean and compact as possible. And it's a hard concept to explain just verbally. So if I'm going to switch to the actual Graveler package, because inside of it, there is an example dashboard that's fleshed out called Geodude. And it itself has its own little modules, right? So I'll show you what it looks like by default. Oops. Didn't set my working directory. Again, there you go. So this is the default example. You can also run this yourself with, I believe, what is it? It's Graveler. Geodude example as well with no parameters in it. But so in this first tab, you notice that there are 4 graphs here, right? Representing Anscombe's quartet. So with a couple of ggplotlies and whatnot. So how did I build this, right? Did I write a ggplot code 4 different times? No, because let's say someone tells you I want to change those dots from a horrendous lime green to an actual human visible color. So in my module, here's my UI, right? I have just a 2x2 grid of charts. And you'll notice in my plotlies renders, I have my own custom function here. So I have my data set and it pipes into a function. And that's what this FCT display file is for. It's to put all of your functions into one place so that if you need to edit parts of your dashboard, you only need to edit one piece of the code, right? Where it's duplicated. So in this case, let's say I want to change it back to orange. I can save this, rerun the dashboard, and it should work just fine. And there you go. All 4 graphs update with the new orange color. And this applies to any ggplot option or data table option or whatever functionality you have in your data. The other advantage to adding functions to your FCT file is everyone's favorite, documentation, right? Dashboards and their functionalities at this level can become incredibly complex. And so it's always good to have functions and documentation for those functions so that yourself or other people reading your dashboard code 6 months down the road will understand what this code's actually trying to do. And the other benefit is, if you recall, if we run these lines, I should be able to export from my package and look at that. There's my custom function. Guess what happens when I put the question mark in front of it? It builds the actual help documentation per Roxygen documentation for code. So all of this workflow with Golem and whatnot is trying to help you standardize your package development, standardize your dashboard development, actually create documentation for packages down the road. Finally, before we get into a little more customization, there is the final file that we had open, which was this O2 deploy. So what O2 deploy does is when you publish your dashboards on RStudio Connect, they break for good reason because they need to have different environment variables to connect either to database credentials, or if you're using pins, you need to have your API key in there somewhere. And RStudio, by design, you can't set these beforehand, right? So you have to publish and then add them after the fact. So what this does is it does it programmatically, right? You can go in and add your environment variables by yourself, by hand, by adding the name and the value. But what this does is it uses the Connect API library, which I believe is still in development mode, so it's not a CRAN package yet. But you can load this, you can load your custom URLs. Ours will be Snap Finance, whatever, at whatever URL. And then you can connect to the server you set the server variables, you connect to the server, then you find the ID for that piece of content you're deploying. You can paste that whenever, and then you can add the environment right here, right? So in this example, I'm finding whatever I just published, I get the environment for that published content, and I add a new variable called key, and then I set my own, or I set it equal to whatever my API key is personally. Right? And so that saves us a lot of time with deploying stuff in RStudio Connect. But I imagine you're probably asking yourself at some point, well, this is great, but I don't want this like brown and gray dashboard, right? I have a very cool purple or blue or yellow business, right? I want to brand my own dashboards. So if you go into this theme file right here at the very bottom, that's where you can just set your colors. So there's 3 colors you can do: primary, accent, and secondary. You can omit these entirely and just kind of, customize everything line by line. I don't feel like you need to do that, but be my guest. So if I just change these colors to, I don't know, I only know so many hex codes. We'll go that red and black. So if I run my dashboard again, it will update with these colors. So my primary is this dark red, this accent is this bright red, and then there's this like black bar on the left for this sidebar option here. Again, there's more customizability you can do, but that's what I've deemed sufficient for the average user, is those 3 colors. As well as the logo. Let's say you have your own custom logo to do. Just like in a standard Shiny app, all of the external assets are in the Insta-app www folder. So you just add your logo here and replace the header value with the new file path. So here's the file exists. But then if I go into the header back in the R folder, here's that file path is. So I would just replace this with your logo, .svg, png, jpeg, whatever. You can also attach URLs. So whenever we publish content, the title and the logo will link back to our content page. So instead of like hitting the back button or anything like that, they can just like right click the title and open a new tab back to the content page. By default, it just goes to RStudio's products page. So you can change those however you want. But with that, I believe that's it for like the Graveler dashboard workflow itself. Again, I'm not going to go into creating UI elements or pin calls or anything like that, because that's you can research. There's plenty of better documentation than I could ever make out there for that. So we'll switch back to the PowerPoint really quick. That's the part where it goes back here. Yeah. So potential enhancements. If some of you've worked with this kind of dashboarding or like customization before, you might have thought of these ideas already. So as far as with any code, there's always improvements to be made. Here's what I've thought of for the Graveler package immediately. So as of like Shiny 1.5, there's a new method of calling modules. So instead of the actual call module function, there's, I think, module server is what it does. It has a simpler syntax and understanding. So it'd be cool if I could convert it to that. Obviously, with the dashboard themes package, you have those colors and that customization, but BSLib has been integrated with Shiny already, and so you can use that more intuitively and create cleaner colors and layouts. Again, at the time when I built this, none of these things existed 2 years ago. And then finally, packages live on testing, right? The more complex your dashboard is, the more points of breakage you're creating itself. And so if we can somehow, connect unit tests to be put on these like dashboard packages, that would be great. It's just one of those areas that, again, I don't really have a fundamental understanding of unit testing. And so I have trouble automating something I don't really know the ins and outs of. But in general, you'll spend less time debugging all of your parameterized code. But with that, that's all I had to talk about, like from a high level. So, I mean, feel free to ask questions about like the package itself, either the backend, how it's doing its things. But in general, Graveler allows like our new developers to start building dashboards right away. We have about like a 2-week onboarding period with like intermediate SQL and R training, and then in-house training as well. And after the end of 2 weeks, we give them a week to build their first Graveler dashboard, that workflow. And so, I mean, the turnaround of 15 business days, you have people building, some of the best, shiny apps you can, well, I guess not the best shiny apps you can make, robust shiny apps very, very quickly. So huge shout out to RStudio as well. I mean, it itself was a game changer for us, but the ability to like integrate with GitHub and package manager, and being able to install our custom packages like Graveler to use and publish, our workflow has gotten a lot more simple and a lot more standardized.
Thank you so much, Alan. I always say we're all clapping, even though you can't hear us. We can use our clapping emojis here on Zoom. But thank you so much for your presentation. And I also want to put a shout out for a great blog post that Alan recently wrote as well, which walks through this too, and includes a lot of great links too. So let me put that into the chat right here. But just a reminder too that you can raise your hand on here to ask questions, and I can just call on you, or you can use the Slido tool to ask questions anonymously as well. But I see there is one over on Slido, so let me go to that first. One was, have you worked with the Golem team at all on the package?
No, I have not. I believe I met one of the authors at RStudio conference a couple of years ago. Just I want to get like his thoughts on like what Golem was, but it was just a very small conversation, and no, I haven't worked with them at all. That'd be cool though. But
definitely, I see John also put a question into Slido, and John, feel free to jump in if you want to ask a question live too, or add context, because I'll read it first. But are there any plans to include any simple GUIs in the package, either to link modules to other files and or to diagrammatically show modules and how they fit?
Yes. So we've thought about that in the past. Definitely there's room for module templates. So I mean, you can, just like I wrote box width array, you can just put this as a default, and so it can make kind of like these little template layouts. It's just not something I've had time to work on in the past, but that is an idea we've had. As far as the second half of the question, actually, can you read it again, Rachel, just so I make sure I heard it right?
Yes, 1 second. It was, so of course, plans to make a simple GUI in the package, either to link modules to other files or to show modules and how they fit together.
Yes, the diagram thing.
Yep.
So I don't really know how to do that from like a package programmatic perspective. I've done it personally, just making like in like a README file for a project. I'll make just a quick little diagram with either diagram R or various flowchart packages. So if there's a way you can do it programmatically, that would be awesome. I do know I always forget what the code is, but there's something like they use this package or the RS Connect package where it's like create manual. I don't know, but whenever you search a package on Cran, it has like the big PDF, right, where it links to all the functions and then kind of displays all of that. You can actually build one of those for your dashboard and all of its functions with just one line of code, right? So all you would have to do is, I closed the wrong file. Once you'll go this far in your run dev file, so you actually have access to your, that happens every now and then. I think it's just a version of my R thing. Anyways, once you get this far in your package, and so you can like export everything, you can create that PDF somehow. I always forget how to do it, but that's what I have for that question.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan. I see MJ just asked in the chat, can we get this recording? And yes, I will share it up to the RStudio YouTube, as well as on the Meetup page and LinkedIn and Twitter, or anywhere that I mentioned the Meetup as well. But I did just put the playlist of all Meetup recordings there in the chat too. And again, I would love to hear from you all too. If you want to jump in and ask questions, feel free to just raise your hand on Zoom, or I can even take unmuting yourself as raising your hand. know it's hard sometimes in these virtual rooms, but I like to imagine we're all there in person together. Ravi, I see you just put a question into the chat if you want to jump in. And it is, what's your opinion on Shiny Mobile?
Yes. So we looked into Shiny Mobile once upon a time. And as cool as it was just such a new framework to do that we had already pretty much doubled down on like Golem and Graveler and this method of building. So we didn't find a ton of value back then in trying to also learn Shiny Mobile. That's slightly changed because with the growth of our business, we have more focus on like our like external sales team that's out in the country, and so they primarily work on mobile devices, and so that's something we're currently trying to revisit, but it's still in the early stages of planning. So I don't really have much more info on that.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to actually stop the recording so people feel comfortable jumping in too with other questions. But for the recording, thank you all for watching.